sweet question here, which is a good one. Would you please talk more about freedom with and freedom from, rather than freedom from? And yeah, we could spend a lot of time on that. What can I say about that? For the longest time in my experience, I lived for another period of my life. I lived for another today. I lived for a moment where everything was going to look the way I thought it should look. And that was my goal. That was my sense of, when I get to this, everything will be okay. And as a result of that, I lived my life with what looked to be a proverbial control panel in my head, and was constantly playing with trying to adjust, configure, tweak, whatever, all of those levers, so that I got it to the state where I thought, yeah, everything will be okay now. I've got it configured just right. And there were a lot of problems with that. One is it's a lot of work trying to configure all those things. And I had a lot of things that I was trying to make a certain way, you know, health, work, relationships, fitness, emotional mood, friendships, goals for my life. Like, there were so many of those things that I was trying to adjust to get it right. And that day of peace never seemed to come. So that was problematic. And even if I managed to get things right, it was very soon that I would then get to a point where I was like, okay, well, I've reached this. Well, what now? And then something else would kick off in my mind, and I'd be then chasing after this next thing. And so there was always this attempt to get somewhere other than where I was. And I think as a race, as a species, we've been conditioned to innocently believe that life will be okay when, and then you fill in the blank, whatever that is. And we're all walking around with, 6-7 billion different permutations of what that might look like. Now, there was a point when that started to change for me. And there's a couple of things that spring to mind. The first occasion was one day I woke up feeling very depressed about my life. And I had a lot of goals that were actually written down on a piece of paper. And I looked at those goals one day and I was like, well, what is it that you're looking for in creating all of this? And I realized that when I really sat with every single one of those things, I was looking for peace. And I was like, wow, I'm more miserable than I've ever been in my life, because now I've got so many things that I think I need to now change and fix in order for me to be at peace. And in that moment, a lot of those things didn't make sense anymore. Like, well, they're just making me miserable. And then there was another thing that happened. And it was when I did an intensive with Michael Neal. And I went there still with a list of things. And I went there hoping he was going to help me to fix it all. And I went there and, we talked about some of this stuff for half an hour, I don't know. And then we had a break, and then he put something on the table and he said, look, you got 3 options, John. You can talk about your list of stuff that you want to change. You can talk about your thinking about, that list of stuff, or we can talk about what it is to be in the human experience. And he said, my experience is that the third option will be the most valuable for you. Now, as somebody that had spent his life configuring the circumstances and then learning about NLP and everything else like that, then configuring the thinking about those things, it struck me that I wasn't doing very well with those two. So I went for option 3. And we spent 3 days looking at what it was to be okay in the human experience, looking at what was behind it, looking at the nature of it. And I got to the end of that 3 days, and I was astounded that I was feeling at peace. and yet nothing had changed on that list. And it struck me that the freedom that I had been looking for in trying to move away from or move towards something else was actually ever present underneath my resistance to how my life actually was. And so we live our lives innocently believing that we can only be at peace when we have changed something, whether it is a circumstance, whether it is an emotion. We live our lives trying to move away from something or move towards something. And all of that moving away from and moving towards something is made up of a whole load of noisy thinking, figuring out, trying to get somewhere, troubleshooting, assessing of pros and cons. All of that sort of stuff is noise that covers over the freedom of who we are. And so we keep thinking that our freedom is the doing, when our freedom is in fact a being. It's a state of being that exists before all of those attempts to get somewhere other than where we are. And so when we speak of freedom with, it's a way of pointing to the fact that the thing that we're looking for is actually able to show up when we recognize that the only thing that is stopping us from experiencing it is the resistance that we might have to an event, circumstance, or experience. So you can have anxiety, and if you're recognizing the safety and the nature of anxiety, you don't resist it. So you sit in the freedom of who you are, watching, observing, and being with that anxiety. When you recognize that your freedom is innate and you find yourself in a really difficult set of circumstances, really wanting to change that, it's really very valuable to be able to see that that freedom is again there underneath all the attempts that you might be making in your mind to try and get rid of that thing. And as I reflect on how it's been for me, particularly over the last 2 years, for want of a better calculation, there has been this growing sense of freedom that I have experienced, despite the fact that the circumstances have become more challenging. The human experience aspect of it has become more bumpy and roller coaster than it has ever been. And yet, the more I'm looking towards the fact that there is some part of me that is free no matter what, the more it is undermining the complaints in my mind that I need to go somewhere else other than where I am. And as a result, even though my life is more restricted, as everybody's is to some extent, even though it's more restricted, ironically, the level of freedom that I have felt with that has been much greater. And that's only because I see more and more and more that freedom is a state of being. It is not a doing. It is not a resistance. It is not a fight. And so the more you are looking towards that, where is freedom or peace or quiet or well-being? How is that showing up? Noticing when you are organically just in that space in your life and yet nothing has changed. Start to get puzzled about the nature of that and look to where freedom really is. And the more you start to see its nature, the more resilient you are with your experience, the more resilient you are with the bumps in your circumstances, and the more free you are no matter what is going on in life. So I hope that's helpful.